This is Damon Fordham, adjunct professor of history and author and historian at the Citadel in Charleston Southern University. And I'm here because a couple of hours ago I was asked to speak at a rally with Pastor Thomas Dixon called the Hate Won't Win Rally. And it was pretty well received, and since the vast majority of you were not there to see it, I figured I would share what I had to say there with you, the general public, here on Facebook, as well as YouTube. So here it goes. In understanding the issues of hatred and racism, we have to understand that you cannot find a cure until you know the cause of something. And the cause of the race problem in our society began with Father Bartolomé de Casas. He was a Spanish priest, and he came along with Columbus during his third voyage back in 1502. And he was horrified because Columbus's maltreatment of the Native Americans of the Caribbean. So he had a solution for the problems of the enslaved Native Americans of the Caribbean, but it was not a complete solution. It was one where he decided, instead of enslaving the Native American Indians, go to Africa and get the blacks instead. He saw the damage that that situation did, and he would beg God for forgiveness for what he called his ignorance and error in 1527. But by then, the damage had been done. So 170 years later, in colonial Virginia, you had the poor white indentured servants. These were the poor whites who were basically enslaved as a result of their punishment for debts and petty crimes in England and Ireland and other such places. For 7 years, they would be essentially the slaves of the plantation owners in colonial Virginia and other such places. And they were right there in the fields along with the enslaved blacks. All right? So they're working side by side, and they're getting along rather chummily, for lack of a better word, and they're even socializing and having children together and so forth. But the colonial government of Virginia feared that these enslaved blacks and these white indentured servants might come together and realize they had a common oppressor and overthrow them. That almost happened in 1676 with Nathaniel Bacon. One of the indentured servants tried to start Bacon's Rebellion, with the black slaves and the indentured servants coming together against the colonial Virginia government. But Nathaniel Bacon died of dysentery before that could go all the way through, to which the colonial government of Virginia said, "Whew, that was close. We can't let that happen again." So they passed laws that kept the blacks in a permanent caste of slavery and cheap labor. And the poor whites basically got the crumbs off of the table, so to speak. They got a little bit more than the enslaved blacks, but just enough so that the poor whites would feel that they were superior to the blacks. In other words, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. And that's what racism is all about, Charlie Brown. All right? Now, many people, of course, one of the problems of all this is that the average person knows only what they see and what they are told. So, of course, they're told about what happened with the Native Americans in this country. And you have people who have a very bad attitude toward our folks from south of the Texas border and so forth. But here's the thing to think about, okay? Did you know that before this country was owned by the English, that the Spanish colonized America almost 100 years earlier? That's right, folks. In much of the 1500s and a small part of the 1600s, it was actually the Spanish who were running things in America. Something to think about, right? So then, of course, you have nowadays this issue with Stop Asian Hate. Well, a lot of people don't know that that's been going along a lot longer than many people realized. In 1882, they passed what was called the Chinese Exclusion Acts. The people of that time felt that the Chinese were cheap labor that would take away jobs from people who were born in the United States. And they were effectively kept out of the United States until 1943. Well, the great freedom fighter Frederick Douglass, the man who basically learned how to read during slavery and negotiated with Abraham Lincoln for the freedom of his people and so forth. These were his words on the subject of the Asians back in 1869, and they have a lot to say to us today. I want a home not only for the Negro, the mulatto, and the Latin races, but I want the Asiatic to find a home here in the United States and feel at home here, both for his sake and ours. Right wrongs no man. If respect is had to majorities, the fact that only 1/5 of the population of the globe is white, the other 4/5 are colored, ought to have some weight and influence in disposing of this and similar questions. It would be a sad reflection upon the laws of nature and upon the ideas of justice, to say nothing of a common creator, if 4/5 of mankind were once deprived of the rights of migration to make room for the 1/5. The voice of civilization speaks an unmistakable language against the isolation of families, nations, and races, and pleads for the composite nationality as essential to her triumphs. Need I say more to that? All right. So after slavery ended, you had what was called the Reconstruction Era in these United States. This is where the victorious North tried to reform the South through 3 constitutional amendments. There were the 13th that said that slavery was ended throughout the United States in 1865, the 14th Amendment in 1868 that said that all persons born here were citizens, and the 15th Amendment that said that all men in this category had the right to vote. Women, of course, were not allowed to vote until 1920 with the 19th Amendment. But in either case, though, that did not make the end of discrimination. African Americans were going to school and voting and holding office, but they were still groups that were opposed to them. And one of the great forgotten black leaders of that era was Bishop Richard Harvey Kane. If his name sounds somewhat familiar to some of you, he was the founding pastor of Mother Emanuel AME Church here in Charleston, South Carolina. And during Reconstruction, he was in Congress. And this is what he had to say to a congressman named Zebulon Vance out of North Carolina, who wanted to ship African Americans back to Africa. These were his words on the subject. The gentleman wishes that we should prepare ourselves to go to Africa or the West Indies or somewhere else. I want to enunciate this doctrine upon this floor. You have brought us here, and here we are going to stay. We are not going 1 foot or 1 inch from this land. Our mothers and our fathers and our grandfathers and great-grandfathers have born here and have died here. Here we have sweated, here we have toiled, here we have made this country great and rich by our labor and toil. It is mean in you now to want to drive us away, after having taken all our labor for 200 years. Just think of the magnitude of these gentlemen's hearts. After taking all our toil for 200 years, after having sold our wives and children like so many cattle in the shambles, after having reared the throne of great King Cotton in our labors, after we have made the rice fields wave with luxurious harvests while they were fighting against the government and keeping us in bondage, now we are free and they want us to go away? Shame on you. I couldn't have said it better myself. Now, I should also mention that Bishop Richard Harvey Kane, he was born in Greenbrier, West Virginia, and educated at the first black college in America that was run by and founded by African Americans, which was Wilberforce University in Xenia, Ohio. But anyway, this Reconstruction era that I spoke of was destroyed because, you see, there was the Army of Resistance of Reconstruction was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in December the 24th, 1865, with 6 Confederate veterans who named themselves after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. And now you know the rest of that story, right? Hello. And so in South Carolina, you had groups like the Red Shirts, who violently resisted Reconstruction, you see. And Part of that was because you had these politicians who, instead of trying to educate their voters to stay in power, they played on the emotions and the bitterness and the frustrations of these people and told them what they wanted to hear instead of telling them the truth to uplift these people, because they figured that the truth was too unpopular and they decided to ride that wave. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say this to you, okay? Whether we're talking about the 1800s or right now, any politician who knows better but tells their people what they want to hear and plays to their emotions and their bitterness instead of telling them the truth, that's not a leader. That is a puppet. Keep that in mind, okay? So anyway, you had people like Benjamin Tillman, who was the senator from South Carolina and the architect of Jim Crow and segregation in the state. They reduced black education to undereducate the African Americans to be a permanent class of cheap labor, you see, and unfortunately we're still dealing with the ramifications of that to this very day, as well as taking away their right to vote and enacting segregation laws for that purpose. But even then, that did not go unchallenged. I'm going to conclude this by reading you the words of Thomas Miller. He was one of the last black representatives from South Carolina, and he later became the founding president of South Carolina State University. Anyway, he said these words to Senator Benjamin Ryan Tillman in the State House in Columbia, South Carolina on October the 25th, 1895, according to the Columbia State newspaper, and it fittingly goes as follows. I want a united people. Let us forever bury the bad deeds of both races in the past. Let us try to bear and forbear. Let us strive to bind the wounds, old wounds of long, long ago, with bandages of loving kindness between the races. God has placed your race and my race here on this continent together. It is our lot to dwell. O countrymen of this Southland, one and all, black and white, let us be just to one another. Let us at all times speak only the truth about our people in the old state. Let us labor to unite our people for the good of the people in common. Let us secure to our children prosperity and happiness founded upon the rock of justice and peace. Justice and peace. Justice and peace. Thank you.